about to tell you what it is. I don't think there is a good, obvious, available answer to human understanding of these things. I do think at the macro level, though, there are good reasons to believe that God uses even the very darkest, horriblest things in the world to achieve eventually good purposes. You know, some really awful things are the only way that some really good things seem to come about, from childbirth to all sorts of other things as well. So I don't want to make light of anybody's suffering. Suffering is always bad, and the Christian God says he's going to eventually take it all away. But in the meanwhile, some things seem to be learned only the hard way, and God is willing to use those hard ways in a way that I find pretty distressing. But I believe he's good because I look at Jesus and I think, if this is God, this is a kind face, I've got to believe that God is still good despite these horrors.
In a lot of your writing, and I gather in your teaching, you convey the importance of approaching all of this with an open mind and an open heart. What would you say to someone who comes to you saying, I'm not sure I want to be won over by the religion that says, if you're Jewish or Muslim or Baha'i, you've got it all wrong? You know, that exclusive claim to the truth and the meaning of life, I think, is a deal breaker for a lot of people who might otherwise embrace Christianity.
Well, I'm actually sympathetic with them. I think that Christians who say that people of other religions have it all wrong neither understand the other religions, and they don't understand their own either. The Christian scripture itself, the New Testament in particular, quotes with approval some of the non-Christian philosophers of the ancient world. Christian theologians in subsequent centuries have themselves learned a lot from Plato, from Aristotle, from some Islamic thinkers, certainly from Jewish thinkers. So it simply isn't a properly Christian view to say everybody else is wrong and we alone are right, not least because Christianity shares beliefs, lots of beliefs with Jewish and Muslim thinkers, but with people in other traditions as well. I think of devotional Hinduism, for example. So it just isn't an informed view to say we alone are right and everybody else is wrong. Where Christians are going to have to dig in, though, Mary, and this is where I'm going to have to take my lumps, is that we believe that as useful and as valuable and as beautiful as so many of the other religions in the world have been, however blessing they have been to other human beings, God has come in Jesus Christ to do the one thing we can't do for ourselves, namely to suffer and to die for the sins of the world. That doesn't mean Christianity is true, but it does make sense. If Christianity is correct, that God has been in Christ reconciling the world to God's self in the picture of Jesus, we don't need 2 or 3 or 10 or 25 saviors. We just need the one. And there's one God who's Lord. So Christians aren't being arbitrary when we say that we think that in Jesus, God has done the one thing necessary that God has to do for the rest of us. We might be wrong about that. Maybe Jesus isn't. Maybe God didn't rescue the world through Christ. But if he did, then it simply makes logical sense that we can respect Muhammad, we can respect Lao Tzu and Konzi and other great religious leaders, but we worship Jesus because there we see God doing what only God can do for us.
You've explored the path a number of philosophers have taken from atheism towards belief, and I'm really interested in William Alston and the barrier of what he'd always been told and what he'd always believed, that religion is the human being's infantile side being expressed, that if you're a believer, you're just looking for a parental figure, a la Freud. How did Alston get around that and make his way to a very sincere kind of belief?
Alston finally comes to believe, I think, a couple of things. As people like him have come to believe. First, it's not necessarily a bad thing to admit that you need help. It's not necessarily a bad thing to admit that you may need the help of a god or gods. To reach out to God as a heavenly parent may not be a sign of weakness or immaturity. It might be a sign of humble recognition of one's place in the cosmos. But I think beyond that abstract idea, Alston simply went to church, and he found, to his own surprise, that he was attracted to some, at least, of what he heard in Christian hymns, some of what he saw in Christian liturgy and architecture, some of what he saw particularly in the kindness that Christians showed each other in their everyday lives. Now, clearly, none of this is a knockdown, drag-out argument from Christianity. People in other religions are kind to each other too. People in other religions have beautiful buildings and worship services and so on. So he wasn't trying to say Christianity alone is right and all the others are wrong. What for him was powerful is that here he felt he was encountering something that he philosophically couldn't account for other than to say there must be God. And this was what led him finally to embrace the Christian understanding of God, because it made the most sense to him.
A question you pose to people: for how many more days do you want to keep living as you do rather than as you could? Tell me what you mean.
Well, the challenge for me is, especially for Canadians, and I think of your interview with Rollheiser, I think it's very difficult to be a seriously spiritual person in Canada today. You could be Christian, you could be Muslim, you could be Hindu, you could be Sikh. To be a seriously spiritual person in Canada today is very difficult. Why? Because I think that the crucial question here is to say, yeah, life is okay, but do you want to lead the best life of which a human being is capable? What would that look like to really care for people well, to really be able to live in a way that you could be morally pleased with yourself, instead of just saying, well, I'm not as bad as those bad people over there. I think a lot of us are kind of sleepwalking through our Canadian lives, and I'd like us to snap out of it and to say, how would you like to try to be a saint? How would you like to try to be a hero? How would you like to be the kind of person that you would like your children to be? That's the challenge I set for myself, and would like to encourage my readers as well.
I wonder if a lot of humble, modest Canadians wouldn't reply, me? You can't be talking about me. How could that even be within the realm of possibility? That does not sound like me.
Totally sympathize with that. So let's make it hero with small letters, not a very bold font. But just
saint
right?
in quotation
That's
marks,
right.
maybe.
As I say, that's why I concluded the way I did. Maybe not a saint. Maybe just the kind of person that you'd like your children to become.
You've referred to this whole project as a big ask, because trying to figure out the meaning of life, your place on the world, why are you here, it's almost comical in how overwhelming that can be. Why are you urging people to approach life that way?
Honestly, Mary, maybe Christianity isn't the best of the religious options. Who could say for sure? I've been a professor of religion my whole life, and I've only known a couple of people who are expert in even 2 or 3 religions. Life's really big. The world's a really big place. Things are really strange. So I guess for me, the challenge is, I go back to William James, the American philosopher, who said, well, what are your live options? I mean, you can't investigate all the religions of the world. Nobody's got time to do that. But of the options in your life that you think are perhaps worth investigating, what's the best of those? If you can't live the best life possible, what at least is the best of the options available to you? Do you want to settle for the life you have now? Or is the hunger you feel for something significantly better a clue that there is something significantly better? That the longing that one feels for a life of meaning and purpose, is that just to be shoved down and self-medicated with alcohol or the latest Netflix special? Or is there something more?
I'm curious about the way you frame resistance to religion, or approaching it in a spirit of cynicism and criticism. That's an approach that keeps us paddling on the surface instead of going deep. What does that mean?
If I think that human beings are incapable of significant and lasting commitments. I'm never going to try to form a serious friendship. I'm going to have real trouble forming a good business partnership. I'm certainly not going to get married. If I'm suspicious that all of these enterprises are doomed to fail, then why would I ever commit? And so many of our fellow Canadians have attachment issues, as the psychologists say, because we've been burned, we've been hurt, we've been betrayed. I get that. The sober truth is that you can't engage in friendship or in a serious business partnership or in a marriage without the leap of faith, without the risk that comes with trusting that this person will somehow not let you down, that they will not fail you. Now, the smart, wise person tries to make jolly sure about the friend or the partner that they really are who they seem to be.
he worked at home.
Why terrified?
Because he was a formidable figure, and he was a very disciplinarian father. I thought of him as a compound of Sherlock Holmes and Mr. Murdstone from David Copperfield. He wasn't as bad as Mr. Murdstone, I assure you, but he felt like that. He was very tough, and he disapproved of almost everything I was and everything I did. He was a very brilliant man, and a scientist, a physicist, and he'd converted the stable block. There was a beautiful L-shaped Victorian stable block in part of the house, and he'd converted that into his laboratory where he worked. He had a sort of company inventing and designing things, and so he was always at home. And his study in the house was where he worked and planned and drew things. And though he had a drawing office as well in the stable block, but mostly he was over the way, as we would call it, i.e., in the stable block. But sometimes he was in the house, and if he was in the house, I couldn't be in the house, because I knew if I skipped around or made a noise or something, there'd be a sort of noise from in the study, and it was just terrifying. If he came into the room, I would just instantly blush and look at the floor. And my brother was the same. I mean, he was a very scary individual.
But he seemed especially disapproving of you.
Yes, he was. I think now, I mean, he said so because he saw something. He thought I was intelligent, and he saw me wasting it in watching television and things like that. He couldn't bear the idea of me watching television. He just, when he was 6, he designed and built his first boat with an outboard motor, and he'd literally done it with his own hands. I mean, and we had a radio set in my room, a huge big thing about the size of this table we're sitting at, which he had built when he was 10, and he'd done all the, he'd bought the valve components and put it together.
And did you have rows? I mean,
No, because I couldn't speak in his presence. So I could never speak back to him. I never dream of it. I was terrified of it. I mean, I really couldn't speak. I was tongue-tied. And my brother, as I say, the same. My sister less so. She was 7 years younger. She was more the sort of typical apple of eye type younger child. But and she could occasionally be quite cheeky too. But we would just never dare. So that was part of the problem, I suppose.
You write about your mother with a lot of fondness and admiration. What was she like?
Well, she is still, and people fall in love with her all the time. She's warm. She's just an incredibly warm, smiley, optimistic person, and extraordinarily considerate and kind. We'd have dinner parties, and again, this shows how old-fashioned we were. When my parents had dinner parties, they're dressed for dinner, which is perhaps not that extraordinary. I either wear dinner jacket, tuxedo, and so on for dinner parties. But also, it would still be the thing where the men would stay in the dining room and the women would go off, and the men would have their port and cigars, and then eventually, shall we join the ladies type thing. But my mother was a wonderful hostess, and so there'd be a sort of pudding served, say. I don't know, let's say it was a peach melba or something, and one person would get a different pudding. And this is just between women. I said, well, I remember that you don't like peaches. And the person would go, how on earth would you know that? I said, well, I remember you saying it once, and it would have been like sort of 12 years earlier. And my mother just always remembered that sort of thing about people. I mean, just astonishingly, just always thoughtful and kind.
Stephen Fry, we were talking earlier about your checkered career in terms of your adolescence, about being expelled from school, stealing. You made a suicide attempt, and yet then you were in prison briefly for the sort of the brief spending spree you went on with the stolen credit cards and so on. Your parents didn't react with anger or admonishment. I mean,
well, when it came to me being in prison, I'd run away from home. I'd gone on the lam, as the phrase is, and had, to cut a long story short, had acquired a couple of credit cards that I went pretty crazy with around Britain. In those days, they didn't have magnetic stripes in. You couldn't, they weren't connected to phone lines. You had that strange little roller carbon system, and people just accepted them. And so I was finding myself able to stay in hotels and buy stuff, and I wasn't doing anything productive or useful. I was just traveling around the place. It was rather absurd. Eventually, I got caught up by the police, and I didn't want to involve my parents. I thought, well, they'd been through enough, the school expulsions and God knows what else. If they discovered I was down in prison, and for all they didn't know where I was because I'd run away. They had no idea where I was.
Do you understand all this? Do you understand why you were stealing?
No, I mean, I'm not sure what sly, dishonest swine. I don't know. I know. Having grown up with such advantages and so on, there's less excuse, if you like, than someone who's grown up with nothing. I don't know what the reason is. It's a mystery, and I'm not sure that one is given to know to understand myself in quite that way. I think it's surprising how much of life is self-observation rather than self-analysis. Like, oh, that's what I'm like. Oh, I see. Oh, I'm going to do this now. And in the case of stealing, I don't know. I mean, there was a yearning for things. It's what I start this book, The Fry Chronicles, with is a sort of list of
your addictions. Yes, to sugar, to tobacco.
Yeah, and they need paying for, as all addictions do, and it's this strange body, mind, spirit trichotomy, I suppose that is, that we all have, and that I hated my body, and yet I had to satisfy it. It needed feeding. It needed this sugar all the time, and then it needed tobacco all the time. And
you even allude to cocaine addiction.
And yes, that obviously came later. That wasn't at school.
that was much later.
It's
yes.
actually after the period the book comes.
Right, and then but there's this little bit where you volume 3. Yes,
exactly.
But apart from being addicted to hard work, do you still see yourself as an addictive personality?
Yes, I do actually, and I suppose I'm just more wary about it. I mean, I don't play computer games for that reason. Is I know I would get addicted to them. I will spend the rest of my life doing it until I'm, sort of that thing that addictions do. Your heart's beating fast, and you're panting in shallow breaths, and your eyes are half closed, and it's 4 a.m, and it doesn't matter whether it's gambling or cocaine or sex or anything. That's the same. You end up as the same person, the same rather hopelessly, shallowly breathing person in a state of anxiety and sloth simultaneously. So I'm sort of slightly more wary, I suppose, about my addictions. But I'm definitely that kind of a person. Yeah. Well, there we are. I don't know why I stole. But my parents did come visit me in prison on the first opportunity they could. And I remember, I think the thing that really slew me, it slaughtered me. I'd always been very fond of doing cryptic crosswords. And as I think I mentioned earlier, my mother and father, I sort of grew up watching them do the Times crossword, which is a cryptic crossword. And then they would complete it together, and what I remember getting the hang of it and being able to do it all on my own, thinking, oh, I've got half my mother's brain and half my father's brain, because I could, and I used to love doing it. And when my parents came to the visiting room in the prison, it's one of those classic things with a sort of window and a talking panel and so on, and my mother turned to the guard and whispered, I don't know what she was saying, and the guard nodded, and I was passed that my mother had cut out all the Times crosswords from the past. Since the day I'd run away, she cut them all out, put them together, cut them very neatly, and put them together in an envelope. And I think that made me more ashamed than anything else. I could make myself cry just thinking of it. And so I remember, going back to the cell and doing all these crosswords, and thinking, that's what she did for me. She always believed in me. It's the last school I'd been to, I remember having been expelled from 3 others. And they sort of knew this, and they were taking me on. And it was a sort of college, a state-funded local college. And I remember my mother saying, "And do you do the Cambridge entrance exam, this separate Cambridge entrance exam?" And they said, "I don't think that would be particularly appropriate in this case." My mother was furious. She said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, I think, let's just hope he can get a few exam results, not worry about something quite out of his reach or something like that." My mother always believed in me, and she always, and I think it was that the crosswords again showed that she still loved me and still had this belief in me.
It's in thinking about the addictive personality, and one of the things you mentioned is sex, but you went through a period, I remember it was even the last time we spoke, when you were in quite a significant, I think it was about 14 years
yes.
of celibacy.
Yes, yes, that's right. I mean, it wasn't exactly a decision, but I suppose by about at least halfway through it had become so clear that I was able to call it celibacy. I'd had a partner at university, and he's still one of my closest friends, and we'd lived together for the first year after university in Chelsea. He had very rich parents and so on, but then I started having to go up to Manchester, where we were doing this television series with Hugh and Emma and Ben Elton and Robbie Coltrane, I was, we were sort of seeing less of each other in that sense, and he took another partner, and we sort of said farewell to each other, and I never got another partner, and I just work was so exciting, and a year passed, and so and everything, and then I was asked to do an article by Tatler magazine. So an assistant editor rang up and said, "Oh, we're doing a series of articles on things people don't do," and he gave a few examples of famous writers and actors and things who said that they never went abroad, or they didn't drive, or they never played golf, or whatever it is, you know. And I remember saying to him, I said, "Well, I can't think of anything I don't do. I like doing everything." He went, "Oh, well, never mind." I said, "Oh, there's sex, of course. I don't do that." He went, "Yeah, that counts, I think." So I wrote this article, which became quite a sort of co-celebrate, and on why I didn't do sex. And so
one thing was it got in the way of work.
Yeah,
you were working
exactly. And it was messy. It was unpleasant. It ended in disaster. And but mostly that it got in the way of work, and that's right. But as soon as that article was written, which was about 1980, which was only about 3 years into my so-called celibacy, the word got attached to me. So whenever I was on a talk show or being written about in the newspaper, it was as the celibate, and that, you know, it was myself and Cliff Richard and Morrissey from the Smiths and so on. It became this trio of Britain's famous celibates. So it just sort of fell out that way, and you know, I got so used to it that I thought that therefore I could never have a partner ever again. You know, I thought I don't really know how it works. I haven't done it since university. I don't know how you meet people and how it all happens, and how you share toothbrushes, and whether you break wind in front of each other, or what's the secret? Of course, what I didn't know is that every time you have a partner, it's the first time. This is the first time you've had that partner, and the first time that partner's had you, and that experience is actually meaningless in such things. It's always the first time. That's what's so exciting about it.
Bestseller is a tale of complicity and heroism, set in a time of repression in Ireland. That's next week. I hope you'll join me.
This is CBC Radio 1, 89.1 FM in Waterloo Region.
Have you visited CBC's Being Black in Canada website? It's an online platform to explore the stories and experiences of Black Canadians from across the country. You'll find relevant news articles and interviews, incredible documentaries, and interesting video clips, Black achievement in sports, and so much more. Discover the wide breadth of CBC content celebrating Black Canadians all in one place. Visit cbc.ca/Being Black in Canada today.
You can call checkup right now.
I do think that people want to gather, but there is a risk.
Easter, Passover, and Canada is facing a sixth wave. Public health restrictions have eased, no mask mandates in most provinces. Is this a normal holiday weekend for you? Is it safe to gather again? You can call checkup right now.
From CBC News, The World This Hour, I'm Khalil Hassanali. We start in Ukraine, where all eyes are on the besieged city of Mariupol. Russia gave Ukrainian soldiers in the city an ultimatum: lay down your weapons by 6 a.m. local time or die. Ukrainian officials say the soldiers are refusing. Chris Brown has more on the situation in Mariupol.
This small band of fighters, it could be in the hundreds, perhaps even a couple of thousand, have been holding out for several weeks, but they've been cut off from any reinforcements. They don't have any new food, and they certainly don't have any more weapons. Estimates are 20,000 civilians dead, maybe more, and certainly lots of gruesome pictures of bodies in the streets. That ultimatum went today, and really, I don't think anyone's surprised that the fighters there said no, they're going to keep on fighting. This really has been a strategic prize for Russia for a couple of reasons. It would eliminate the last Ukrainian presence on the Sea of Azov. It would hand Russia a new port. It would also allow a bit of a land route to connect between Russian-controlled areas of Donbass and Crimea as well.
The CBC's Chris Brown reporting from Kyiv. Elsewhere in Ukraine, air raid sirens sound in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk. Although tens of thousands of residents have already fled, leaving empty streets, British military intelligence report widespread missile and artillery strikes in the east. That says Russia refocuses on taking the Donbass region along the Russian border, but it's also continuing air and missile strikes on cities across the country. Firefighters battle a fire in an apartment building in Kharkiv hit by a missile. Local officials say at least 3 people were killed and more than 30 were wounded. Explosions were also heard in Kyiv, but Ukrainians claim their air defense system shot down incoming missiles. The Archbishop of Canterbury made an unusual foray into politics today. Justin Welby is the leader of the Anglican Church, and in his Easter Sunday sermon at Canterbury Cathedral, he sharply denounced the UK government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
There are such serious ethical questions about sending asylum seekers overseas. The details are for politics and politicians. The principle must stand the judgment of God, and it cannot.
Boris Johnson's government signed a new deal with Rwanda to send anyone who arrives in the UK illegally to the African country. The United Nations has also denounced the plan as a violation of international law. Violence erupted for the third time this week in Sweden. Far-right demonstrators attempting to burn a Quran were met with counter-protesters. It follows a series of anti-Islamic demonstrations in other Swedish cities. Dominic Valitis reports.
The violence erupted following a planned demonstration by the Stram Kurs Party, a Danish far-right anti-Islam group which was planning to burn a copy of the Quran. The authorities had moved the protest to a different location as a so-called preventative measure. A spokesperson says police would not revoke permission for the protest altogether. The demonstration went ahead in the nearby town of Malmo, where a small number of the far-right group's supporters were attacked by counter-protesters. Police were forced to use tear gas to break the crowds up. Last night's violence was just the latest in Sweden. Since Thursday, disorder has been reported in Stockholm and other cities where Stram Kurs either planned or had demonstrations. Dominic Valitis, CBC News, London.
That's the sound of a fuel ship as it sank off the coast of southeast Tunisia Friday. Authorities are desperately trying to avoid an environmental disaster by setting up water barriers. The ship was carrying more than 750 tons of diesel when it sank. And that is the world this hour. For CBC News, I'm Khalil Hassanali.
Here's your weather forecast for London. A few flurries going into the afternoon, then cloudy skies. About 2 centimeters of precipitation expected during the day and a high of 7 degrees. Tonight, clearing with winds up to 15 kilometers an hour and a low of -5. And for Kitchener-Waterloo, mainly cloudy with a 30% chance of flurries during the day. Winds at 20 kilometers an hour, but gusting up to 40 and a high of 7 degrees as well. Tonight, clearing during the evening with winds up to 15 kilometers an hour and a low of -4 degrees.
Hi, I'm Blanca from Spain.
Hi, I'm Bob from Kitchener, Ontario, Canada.
And you're listening to the morning edition with Craig Norris.
We're tuned in the morning edition, CBC Waterloo Norton.
Hey there, I'm Craig Norris.
I'm Carmen Grillo.
And I'm Joe Pavia. Join us on the morning edition weekdays from 6 to 8:30. I'll have traffic info and a full roundup of all the news in Waterloo Region and Wellington County at 6:30, 7:30, and 8:30.
And I'll have the latest weather forecast so you'll be prepared for the day.
And if someone's out there making news, they'll be here to tell us all about it. Plus, you'll hear great local, national, and international music.
For breaking news, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CBC KW 89.1.
And check us out online at cbc.ca/KW.
Every weekday morning from 6 to 8:30 on the morning edition on CBC Radio 1, 89.1 FM, and on the CBC Listen app.
It is clear that we are in the 6th wave of this pandemic, driven by the BA2 variant.
Hi, I'm Ian Hannamansing in Vancouver. Welcome to a special Q&A edition of Cross Country Checkup.
I do think that people want to gather, but there is a risk.
Stay cautious. Put a mask on. It doesn't hurt.
Our question today, is this a normal holiday weekend? Is it safe to gather again? You can call us right now, 1-888-416-8333. 1-888-416-8333.
I was wondering how long after an exposure somebody could be contagious. If we visited somebody on Friday and then visited a different family Saturday or Sunday, how long would it take us to be of concern or contagious?
I have a question about how to handle masks. Early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about being very careful taking off a mask, putting it on, and potential contamination. So are we still concerned about that?
I'm actually calling regarding my 9-month-old son. I feel children under 5 years old aren't really being discussed, and well, of course, we just want to protect them as best we can.
More than 2 years into this pandemic, and we still have lots of questions. And on this holiday weekend, as many families are gathering, those questions have added urgency. How do we protect relatives and friends who are vulnerable from getting very ill from COVID? So we brought in 2 medical experts to answer those questions, from what the wastewater data is telling us to the debate about mask mandates to what you should be doing before getting together. And in the next few days, if you start feeling sick, we're looking forward to your questions and our experts' answers. Our question today, is it a normal holiday weekend? Is it safe to gather again? Our number, 1-888-416-8333. And in the last half hour, it is our Ask Me Anything with senior correspondent Susan Ormiston, back in her home base of Washington, D.C. after deployments to Poland and Ukraine. She'll give us an inside perspective on the war and how Ukrainians are coping. I'm Ian Hannamansing in Vancouver, live on CBC Radio 1 and CBC News Network. This is Cross Country Checkup. And for those of you who are watching on CBC News Network or online, a reminder, you can join the conversation today by calling us while we're on air. I'm going to get to the phones in just a few minutes, but we do have an expert with us today that I want to connect with now. Dr. Peter Uni will be with us for the first 45 minutes of the show. He is a professor of medicine and the scientific director of Ontario's COVID-19 Scientific Advisory Table. We have reached him in Toronto. Hi.
Hi, Ian.
Great to have you on the program again. Let me start with a broad question, and you can take it in any direction you'd like, Dr. Uni. Is it safe, especially on this holiday weekend, to be gathering again?
It depends on how we gather. No, it's very simple. Outdoors is safer than indoors. Small is safer than large. Masked is safer than unmasked. No, so it depends really on the situation you're in, on your risk aversity, and also on the situation of other people in the gathering. So the more vulnerable people there are, the more careful you want to be.
Yeah, I think that personal risk assessment is really important, and I see people employing it all the time. You mentioned among the risk sort of ways to mitigate risk, masks. So let's talk about mask mandates, which have been lifted in much of the country at this point while we're in the midst of a 6th wave. Did we lift these mask mandates too quickly?
I mean, it was risky. Let's face it. It's a question of mentality. Personally, I would have, as many people know, I would have waited a bit longer. But right now, what is important to realize is that we probably are not, facing the same challenges as before, because we just reached so much immunity everywhere in the country. Now, so just to give you a hunch right now, it looks as if here in Ontario, based on what we were able to triangulate with our models, with wastewater, etc., that we probably have around already 45% of the population that has been infected with Omicron, BA1, BA2, BA11 since 1st of December, 45%. And what this means is that in addition to the 3rd doses that many of us have received, we also develop immunity through infection, and immunity now starts to help control the pandemic. That's very clear. So if what we saw, and it really seems that it's real, is not just a fluke here in Ontario, we bended the curve. The curve basically is probably flat right now. We don't know yet. Do we go up a bit again because of the current holidays? Do we stay flat, at a high level, a high plateau, or do we start to go down? But by all means, immunity contributed to control. There is also, James change of behavior of people, of course, and the good weather helps. I didn't look up how the weather is in Vancouver, but here it's actually pretty nice. Is it the same at your end?
Oh, kind of. I think we're having a very similar day to Toronto, where it is not raining, but it is cool. But yes, I mean, people very much encouraged to go outside, and I've heard from you and from infectious disease doctors from the beginning of this pandemic, outside is definitely safer than inside. I should remind our audience on CBC News Network, we are live here, and we encourage both our radio listeners and our television viewers to give us a call here on Cross Country Checkup. And our question this week, is this a normal holiday weekend? Is it safe to gather? And right now we're talking to Dr. Peter Uni about some of those issues. You mentioned the number of people, 45%, I think you said, in Ontario who have been infected with COVID since December. Add to that, as you point out, the third doses many people have, and there is a relatively high level of immunity among the population. How long will that immunity last for the people who got COVID in the last 2 or 3 months?
It's very difficult to tell right now. As a rule of thumb, I'd say, if you have been infected less than 2 months ago, you're probably still very well protected. Where it starts to wane, if you have had an infection on top of 2 doses, for instance, of a vaccine, probably also depends a bit on how severe.
Hi, that can I help you?
Hi, can I get a large iced coffee with extra sugar?
Okay.
And sesame, actually, do you have everything bagel?
Yes, we do.
Everything bagel toasted with plain, actually butter?
Plain cream cheese and butter?
No, just a butter, please.
Okay.
And could you put some extra butter on side as well?
Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
Just large iced coffee and everything bagel toasted with extra butter.
Yeah.
Okay, Jayatha, please.
Thank you.
Hi, 472.
I have Tim's card. MasterCard, please.
Got it. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I have a straw, please? Thank you much.
Questions 1-888-416-8333, 1-888-416-8333, a special Q&A edition of Cross Country Checkup, all about this pandemic. Is this a normal holiday weekend? Is it safe to gather again? We're going to go to the phones in just a sec, but I have one more question for you now, Dr. Uni, and that is about immunization. So NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, has strongly recommended the deployment of a second COVID booster shot for seniors aged 80 and older. Of course, this is a country with different rules depending on the province. In New Brunswick, adults 50 and above qualify. In Ontario, the age is 60. What's your view of a second booster shot at this point?
We need to be aware of that the threshold is a bit arbitrary now, but what is very clear is the older or the more risk factor somebody has, age is the most important risk factor still, the more likely people will benefit tremendously. And what the fourth dose does, based on everything we know, it brings you back to where you were protection-wisely with the third dose, which is qualitatively different than before. The step from the second to the third dose really deepens and widens your immune response, and you're just much better protected. The fourth one is now the first real booster. It just brings you back to where you were. But this is a 3-dose vaccine, and now this fourth dose would really be reserved mainly for people who are really at increased risk. And now where you set this cutoff, is it 80 and 70? That's what NACI did. Would you go perhaps, as in Ontario, a bit lower than that? That's a bit in the eyes of the beholder. What is very important is, if you're above the age of 40 even actually, and you haven't had your third dose, you really should get it because you benefit tremendously. Then you have your vaccine series completed. I know NACI doesn't phrase it that way yet, but it's very clear that only 3 doses are actually giving you, the full-blown protection. And then with the 4th doses, certainly above the age of 80, go for it. No, we just our granddad here of the family, my dad, was just visiting, and we didn't know whether we had COVID here just in the house because our daughter had exposure in school, and we just rushed to get him vaccinated. He's 82, of course.
Let's go with Tracy's first question first, which is, do we know anything about when a vaccine for children under 5 will be approved and available in Canada?
Yeah, it's actually good what you just said, Ian. It's under 5. So 5-year-olds can get vaccinated. And again, looking at our data here in Ontario, it's very clear. Vaccination really also protects against serious outcomes in children. The risk to end up in hospital, luckily during this wave, currently here in Ontario, is low for children. And we also see very few children in the ICU, and at least that is a little bit of good news. So when the vaccine actually just will make it, it's at least to me, it's not completely clear. You do remember the situation, it didn't work out with 2 doses. This may well have been a dose problem. With Pfizer, Moderna now looks a bit better, but I really couldn't tell. I would not expect that we're anytime soon ready, that it would still be relevant for the current wave. This will just be something that probably will need to be considered much later in the year when we get ready for a next wave, which hopefully will only be late autumn. And then the other part, perhaps, sorry if I just may, Ian, is this okay? Mm-hmm. Just quickly once more. It's important. I understand, where you come from. And we also have friends, with kids below the age of 5. What is important to realize is qualitatively, this is probably a bit similar to an RSV infection, respiratory syncytial virus, which we all, deal with as parents. With our kids, they bring that home, and there is sometimes it happens, that the child needs to go to hospital because of that. Our little boy, he's not that little anymore, he's 8, had this challenge, we ended up in hospital with him repeatedly at the time, but not because of COVID, because of RSV or similar viruses, and this happens. We need to be aware of that, but the good news is, so far what we know is that this Omicron also really behaves differently in children. For instance, my colleagues just told me, and this is anecdotal right now, but here in sick kids, that they don't see, MISC, this multi-systems inflammatory syndrome after Omicron at any level that was comparable with what they saw with Delta. So taken together, this means, yes, I understand the frustration. No, we can't vaccinate yet, but luckily the risk is relatively low. And the point is, this wave will be over relatively soon. If we reach the plateau, we're typically a bit earlier here in Ontario, but we also have had less infection until Omicron hit than many other places in the country. And if we reach the plateau, then others will reach the plateau soon too, and then we go down and things will get better. Our kids still mask in school, but not all of the children are, of course.
Lots of people calling with questions. Our number 1-888-416-8333. And our question is this a normal holiday weekend for you? Is it safe to gather again? Dr. Peter Uni is here to answer questions for the next half hour or so. Then we'll bring in another expert to get it'll be a similar perspective, because it'll be evidence-based answers about COVID, but interesting to get a second voice in there. Dr. Uni, I want to go to other calls, but the second question she had, I think, is one that probably resonates with a lot of people across the country. They're not getting case counts every day in Saskatchewan. I assume in the entire country that's the case. There's the wastewater data. She hears about so many people who are getting sick with COVID, and I think her question was, sure, you say risk assessment, but how am I supposed to figure out what my risk is and how I should conduct myself? What would you say to her on that second question?
So we still get the daily case counts, but they're not useful, because we undercount so much tremendously right now in the middle of this wave, or at the peak of the wave. that the only thing you can just try to understand is probably based on wastewater indeed. So you did the right thing looking there, and test positivity, that's the other part as well. And right now it's relatively safe to assume that probably what we're experiencing right now here, when we just again model the wave, and when we also look at wastewater and use daily growth in wastewater to understand how we were doing over time, since we weren't able to properly test anymore around the second half of December. When we do all of that, it just means that right now we see roughly 5% of the population being actively infected, meaning they can transmit to others. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you see this everywhere. And I mean, when I look, it's remarkable. I think of the people I meet in the streets when we go for a walk or so, I think every second family says, "Oh, we just had it." Mm-hmm. That's really what's happening, and this is that's also a bit of a new normal we're talking about here. But luckily, and this is really the power of immunity, we still struggle less. And right now, at least in our province, it looks as if we will not have the same burden in our healthcare system than what we had during the first Omicron wave. Why? Not because of BA2 being milder or whatever, because of us being much more fit to deal with the challenge. That's immunity.
This is Cross Country Checkup. I'm Ian Hannamansing. We're talking to Dr. Peter Uni, and he is here to answer any and all your questions on where we're at in the pandemic, particularly on this long weekend as you try to figure out what your plans are, but even in the next few days as you think about going to the hockey game or a restaurant or staying at home or whatever else you have in mind. We have lots of people on the phone, so I'm going to try to speed up the pace a little bit and get through as many calls as I can. Flora is calling, and Flora, because of what you're about to disclose about your situation, we're going to not identify you any further than that, but you tested positive this morning. Tell us about that.
Yes, I tested positive, and today is the 8th day. Last Sunday, I was on my way to church services, and my nose was drooping a little bit, and because I had been out of town the day before, I thought, oh, I better test myself, and when I tested, it was positive, and I've been testing myself twice a day, once in the morning and in the evening. Mm-hmm. And this morning, yes, I tested positive again, but I don't have any symptoms. I'm not coughing. My nose isn't dripping anymore. It did for the first 3 days, actually last Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and part of Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And but my chest isn't hurting. I didn't have a fever. None of the usual things, like when you get a common cold or flu or something. Mm-hmm. None of those things happened. And the most surprising thing for me was when my nose was dripping, it didn't hurt. You know how it is when you have a common cold and your nose is dripping and it starts to hurt around your nostrils. Mm-hmm. It didn't do that, and I thought, which I appreciated, mm-hmm. but the thing was, that's all that happened. Yeah. And I mean, I'm still active. I mean, I have a lot of interest, so I just continue doing things that I usually do, and
But you stayed isolated. You stayed isolated at home, I guess, Flora?
Yeah, I just stayed at home, and I didn't allow anybody to come in here. Other family members, I didn't allow them to come. I said, no, not this time. Yeah. And now I'm getting really frustrated. I'm getting pretty upset about this. And
it's been 8 days. That's a long time. Do you have a question for Dr. Uni, Flora?
Yeah. When do I stop being contagious? I mean, even in the house, I wear a mask because I live with 2 other family members. I wear a mask, I wear rubber gloves, I have sanitizers in every room. Like the kitchen has 2, I have 2 in the living room, the washroom, the bedrooms.
Okay. All right, listen, what a diligent patient you are. And let me ask Dr. Uni, when's Flora going to feel confident that she's not contagious?
I guess you're vaccinated. How many doses have you had?
I've had my 2 vaccines and a booster.
2 plus a booster, okay. And the booster was when?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
The booster was when? When did you get it, the booster, the 3rd dose?
Yeah.
When did you get the 3rd dose?
I did. I got the 3rd.
Yeah, but Flora, how long ago did you get the 3rd dose?
Oh, how long ago? Oh my gosh, that's too. I have to pull that information out.
Yeah, I mean, do you remember? Was it the
That's
new year,
okay.
January or February?
No, I think it was later than that.
Okay, good. So, and no, the other thing, don't wear rubber gloves. Doesn't make any difference at all. Don't test daily, it just confuses you. And now you just need to tell me, when did you start to have symptoms? Was it also 8 days ago or even earlier?
No, it was last Sunday morning.
Okay, good. So we tested first positive, that's 8 days ago. I would, if you want to play this really safe and you don't have symptoms anymore anyway, you go to 10 days. But I don't know in which province you are. You would also need just to follow the rules, but it's really quite unlikely already that you're actually still infectious. It could be, it has been shown. So the problem is there's a long tail. You know, some people actually will relatively soon stop shedding the virus or infectious virus, and others a bit later. If you're 10 days beyond, you just go back to whatever you did, and the way you did it before, that's okay.
Yeah, I guess the complicated thing, just to jump in here, Flora, I believe the complicated thing is you have an event you want to go to tomorrow, and there may be older people there, I guess, right?
Well, definitely there will be. I don't plan on mingling with anybody. Like, I'm going to keep my distance. I just want to show up, and just, make my presence known. But I mean, I'm not going to, it's not a social thing. It will be not a social thing for me. Yeah.
Okay, I get it. So, this is a bit a mentality question. You don't want to endanger other people. So it depends on how you handle that. Remember, I can't give personal medical advice or so, but it depends a bit how you want to play. So first of all, if you could meet outside rather than inside, still wear a mask and stay away. Then it's perfectly safe. If you do that
is my plan. It's warm enough now to be, to just be outside.
Look, then don't worry at all. Look, we need to be aware. You need to be aware of there are people out there who actually are infectious who don't even know because they're asymptomatic or will only become symptomatic in the near future. You are most likely really on the downward the downward slope, at the very end, and you probably are not even infectious right now. It's just a rapid test still being positive. If you play it that well outside a mask, you are safer than many other people actually that you will see there, for other people. So don't worry and just follow what you actually were suggesting. Outdoors, and outdoors, if you stay 2 meters away, you don't even need a mask. If you go closer than 2 meters, yes, a mask is great.
Great advice, Dr. Uni. Thank you very much, and thank you for the call. You are listening to, or perhaps watching, Cross Country Checkup on CBC Radio and CBC News Network. Is this a normal holiday weekend for you? Is it safe to gather again? We are looking forward to your questions. 1-888-416-8333. Sheila McLaurin is calling from Cars, Ontario. Do I have the community name right, Sheila?
That's correct.
All right. And what's your question for Dr. Uni?
I'm just calling with regards to the antiviral treatment Paxlovid. I wanted to draw listeners' attention to 2 useful sources of information. The first is CBC radio program podcast, The Dose, that's hosted by Dr. Brian Goldman. And on the 13th of April, he hosted and interviewed a longtime pharmacist who's an associate professor in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Waterloo. And they had a very fulsome conversation that answered pretty much the questions that most people would have.